The road into Cedar Ridge came down from the high pass in long, switching curves, and by the time it leveled out at the edge of town, the afternoon light had already gone amber and thin. She had been walking the last 4 miles, ever since the pickup truck that carried her this far turned off at a ranch gate without a word of warning. The driver hadn't been unkind. He just had somewhere else to be, and she didn't. She shifted the duffel higher on her shoulder and kept moving. Cedar Ridge was the kind of town that looked smaller the closer you got to it. A hardware store. A diner with a hand-lettered special on the window. A post office the size of a garden shed. A few streets of clapboard houses climbing the lower slope, wood smoke already threading up from their chimneys into the cooling air. October in the Rockies came fast and stayed. She counted her money while she walked, without taking it out. She knew the number already, $31 and some change, enough for 2 nights in a motel if the motel was cheap and she didn't eat, not enough for both. She wasn't going to spend it on a motel. The diner was warm through its windows and smelled like coffee and grease and something baked, and she let herself look at it for exactly 1 moment before she looked away. She had learned that trick early. Look once, move on. Wanting something you couldn't afford cost energy she didn't have to spare. What she needed was somewhere quiet, out of the wind, somewhere she could lay her bag down and think, without anyone asking her questions she didn't know how to answer yet. She walked to the far edge of town, where the last street dead-ended at a gravel turnaround and the tree line started. The pines here were old and close-set, their lower branches stripped bare by decades of mountain winters. Beyond them the slope rose steeply, and the light between the trunks was going gray and fast. She stood at the edge of the gravel and scanned the tree line the way she always did in a new place, methodically, left to right, reading the shapes. Most of it was just forest. Then her eye stopped. There was a roof line in there. Set back from the trees, maybe a 1/4 mile from where she stood, elevated slightly on the slope, a long, low silhouette, darker than the sky above it. Not a house. The pitch was wrong for a house. Flatter, wider, with what looked like an overhang extending along one side. She stood very still and looked at it for a long moment. No lights, no smoke, no vehicles, no sound from that direction except the wind moving through the upper branches. Clearly empty. Clearly had been for a while. She adjusted the duffel on her shoulder and started walking toward the trees. The slope was steeper than it had looked from the gravel turnaround. She picked her way through the pines, stepping over exposed roots and ducking under low branches that dragged wet needles across her jacket. The roof line disappeared behind the trees for a minute, then reappeared as she climbed higher, growing more distinct with each step, longer than she'd first thought. She could make out the overhang clearly now, a covered platform, she realized, running the full length of the building's trackside face. She pushed through a stand of young aspens at the edge of a clearing and stopped. It was a train station, not large, modest even by any standard, but unmistakably what it was. The building ran perhaps 60 feet along the platform, clad in horizontal timber boards that had gone the color of old pewter. The platform itself was buried under a thick, undisturbed mat of pine needles, years of them layered into something almost like felt. The windows were boarded, every one, the plywood warped and dark with moisture but still holding. A painted sign above the main entrance had faded past reading, but she could see the ghost of letters there. She stood at the platform's edge and listened. Nothing. Just wind and, somewhere further up the slope, the soft knock of a dead branch against a trunk. She walked the platform first, the whole length of it, stepping carefully where the boards were soft. Most held. At the far end she found the remains of a luggage cart tipped on its side, wheels rusted, one handle missing. She set it upright out of reflex and moved on. The front doors were padlocked, a heavy, old lock, serious about its job. She didn't push it. Instead, she followed the building around its north end, pressing through a curtain of overgrown juniper that scratched at her arms, and found a narrow service path running along the rear wall. At the back of the building, a door waited, smaller than the main entrance. Wooden frame, the paint long gone to bare gray. No padlock. Just a simple latch with a thumb lever, the metal rough with rust. She pressed the lever. The door swung inward, stiff but not barricaded, hinges complaining in the quiet. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The first room was the station master's office. Small, a desk against one wall, its surface bare except for a film of dust and a ceramic mug turned upside down. Shelves on the opposite wall, empty except for a row of glass bottles and a logbook lying flat. A cast-iron wood stove in the corner, its pipe intact, the grate full of old ash. She crossed to the stove and crouched, laid a hand near the firebox, cold and dry, but the pipe was whole, and the damper opened when she tested it. She stood and looked at the room properly, the desk, the shelves, the solid walls. Then she moved deeper into the building. The room beyond the office was smaller than she expected, and exactly what she had hoped for. A cot frame stood against the far wall, its mattress ticking thin and mouse-chewed at one corner but still holding its shape. A writing desk. Shelves bracketed above it, empty but solid. And there, folded over the back of the desk chair, as though someone had simply stepped out for the afternoon and never returned, a quilt, faded to the color of old leaves, the stitching intact along every seam. She lifted it, shook it once out of habit, and breathed through her mouth while the dust settled. Then she set it back down with something close to care. She laid her duffel on the floor beside the cot and sat on the frame. The metal creaked but held. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in long, slow waves. Inside, nothing moved at all. She slept with the quilt pulled to her chin and the stove cold, because she had no wood yet and no matches worth trusting, but the building itself held the day's warmth longer than she expected. The walls were thick. That was worth noting. She woke before the light. For a moment she lay still, listening for what had pulled her out of sleep. Nothing alarming, just the particular silence of an unfamiliar space, the way a building has its own breathing once a person learns to hear it. Creaks settling in the cold, a branch against the eave. The faint, distant sound of the rail itself, a low metallic hum she felt more than heard, that passed through and was gone. She sat up, found her notebook in the duffel by touch, and uncapped the pen she kept clipped to the cover. Then she began to list. She moved through every room slowly, holding the notebook open and the pen working, trying to see each surface the way a contractor might. Not hopeful, not defeated, just accurate. The stovepipe was intact. The damper functioned. The grate needed clearing. She wrote it down. The office window was cracked along one edge but not broken through. Manageable. The shelving was sound. The desk drawers stuck on humidity but the joints were tight. The floor in the waiting room had soft spots near the south wall where water had come in at some point, but the boards themselves were dry now, and the subflooring felt firm when she pressed her heel against it. She wrote that down too. She noted what she did not have: matches, firewood, a broom, something to seal the cracked window glass until she could replace it properly. She noted what she did have: the tools in her duffel, the quilt, the intact stove, the solid walls, the roof that had held through whatever years had passed. The list grew down the page in her careful, even handwriting, column by column. Problem, assessment, what it would take. The morning light came in sideways through the east window and laid a pale bar across the dusty floor, and she kept writing. She finished the second column and set the pen down. The desk itself still needed a proper going over. The drawers had given her trouble, swollen shut on the left side, stiff but operable on the right, and she had not yet worked all the way to the back of them. She pulled the center drawer out as far as it would go, tilted it up slightly the way old drawers sometimes required, and it gave. Inside, a dry pen, a rusted paper clip, the ghost of a rubber band reduced to powder, and beneath it all, tucked flat against the wooden bottom as though someone had placed it there deliberately and then simply left, a logbook. She lifted it out with both hands. The cover was board stiff, faded to a brownish green she could not assign to any original color. The binding cracked faintly when she opened it, releasing a smell like dry attic air and something faintly mineral. The pages were covered in a slanted, formal hand. Entries dated through the late 1950s, column after column of train arrivals, departures, cargo weights, weather observations. She turned the pages slowly, reading without hurrying, and near the back, folded into quarters and tucked between the last written page and the blank leaves that followed, she found the map. She unfolded it on the desk. It was hand-drawn in pencil, the lines careful and deliberate, labeled in the same formal handwriting as the logbook. The station building sat at the center, the waiting room, the office, the platform, the living quarters at the rear. Dotted lines ran outward from the platform edge, marking property boundaries. To the east, 40 yards or so, judging by the scale indicated along one margin, a small square had been drawn and labeled in 2 neat words. Tool shed. She looked at it for a long moment, then she looked out the east window at the wall of brush and young aspen that pressed up against the far edge of the platform. She put on her jacket. The undergrowth was thicker than it looked from inside. She worked with the multi-tool's largest blade and a length of dead branch she used as a lever, moving through it methodically, cutting what could be cut, bending back what could be bent. The afternoon was cool and bright, the kind of mountain afternoon where the light seems to come from everywhere at once. Sap from broken stems got on her hands. Her shoulders ached. She kept counting her steps eastward. She found the shed at 38 steps, a low structure, wood-sided, the roof intact beneath a mat of accumulated leaves, and one fallen limb she rolled off to the side. The door was held shut by a hasp with a padlock, but the padlock was unlocked, hanging open by its shackle, as if whoever had last closed up simply hadn't bothered. She pulled the hasp free. The door swung outward into the afternoon light, and she stood in the opening and looked at what was inside. The shed smelled of dry wood and old metal, and something faintly sweet she couldn't place. The preserves, maybe, or the cedar planking itself. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. Along the left wall, 3 shelves held mason jars in rows, their lids dull but unrusted, the contents still visible through the glass. Dark jam, pale green beans, something amber she guessed was apple butter. Below the shelves, a hand-cranked lantern sat on a low bench beside coils of copper wire, neatly wound, each coil tied with a strip of cloth. An axe leaned in the corner, its head surface rusted, but the edge still keen when she drew a thumbnail across it carefully. And there, mounted to the back wall on a bracket, the hand pump, connected, she could see, to a pipe that dropped through the shed's plank floor. She primed it the way she knew to, pouring a little water from her own bottle into the top, working the handle in long, steady strokes. The pipe shuddered. It knocked once, twice, then water came, cold, startlingly cold, spilling over her cupped palm and onto the dirt floor, clean and real. She stood there a moment with wet hands in the afternoon light, feeling something she didn't immediately have a name for. Then she got to work. She carried the lantern, the copper wire, and the axe back to the station first. Then she returned for 2 of the mason jars, choosing the apple butter and the green beans, turning each one slowly to check the seals. Both held. She set them on the station master's desk, like a small declaration. The waiting room came next. She had been moving around it carefully for days, working in dim light around the boarded windows, reluctant to disturb too much without understanding what she had. Now she understood enough. She used the flat end of the axe head as a pry bar, working the nails free from the plywood sheets someone had hammered over the 2 east-facing windows. The boards came away with a sound like an exhale, and mountain light, actual afternoon light, gold and unhurried, poured across the waiting room floor for what might have been the first time in 20 years. Dust rose in columns. She let it. She propped the door open and swept from the back wall forward, pushing decades of grit and mouse sign and the dry husks of insects out across the platform's edge. The broom she had found in the storeroom was half-bristled and inadequate, but she worked it slowly and thoroughly the floorboards showed themselves. Oak, she thought, wide planks, still sound. The broken interior door between the waiting room and the office had been hanging at an angle since she arrived, its upper hinge pulled entirely from the frame. She measured the copper wire against the gap, twisted it into a figure-8 bracket, and drove it in with a nail. The door hung straight. She opened it and closed it twice, just to confirm. The walk into Cedar Ridge took 40 minutes on the gravel shoulder of the mountain road, her duffel left behind, and only a canvas tote she had found folded in the storage room, substituting as a shopping bag. The morning was cool and smelled of pine resin and something faintly mineral from the creek that ran alongside the road. She kept to the edge, watching her footing on the loose stone, and thought about the oak floor and how well it had cleaned up. Cedar Ridge was small enough that the hardware store and the library faced each other across the same 2-block stretch of Main Street, which suited her fine. She bought steel wool pads, a box of assorted nails, a small tub of wood filler, and a replacement hinge, paying carefully from the folded bills she kept in her jacket pocket, counting change twice. The man behind the counter asked if she was passing through. She said she was staying for a while. He nodded as if that were a perfectly ordinary answer, which she appreciated. The library opened at 10. She was on the steps at 5:02. The librarian, a woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, showed her without any fuss to the archive room, a narrow space along the back wall lined with flat wooden drawers, and 2 rolled steel shelving units holding bound volumes of the Cedar Ridge Courier going back to 1951. She pulled the 1970s volumes herself and worked methodically, decade first and then year by year, the paper dry and faintly brown at the margins but still legible. She found it in the spring 1974 issues, a small article, not front page, not even close, tucked between a notice about a church rummage sale and an advertisement for a feed supplier. The headline read, "Rail branch funding reallocated. Mountain spur service to conclude in April." She read it twice. The station had not been condemned. There had been no structural failure, no accident, no reason written into the building's bones for its abandonment. A state transportation committee had redirected budget funding toward a larger freight corridor to the south, and the mountain spur had simply lost its operating subsidy. Service ended on a Tuesday in April 1974. According to the article, the Regional Rail Authority had intended to revisit the decision within 5 years. No follow-up article appeared in any subsequent volume she could find. The building had been locked, and then it had been forgotten, the way small things are forgotten when no one person holds responsibility for remembering them. She sat with that for a moment, not condemned, not ruined, just overlooked. She checked the deed references mentioned in a sidebar and wrote down 2 names, the original contracting company and the regional authority's district office, on the back of a receipt she had in her pocket. The librarian, passing through, glanced at the open volume. "Researching something local?" she asked. "The old station," Sadie said, "up the mountain road." The librarian's expression shifted, not alarm exactly, but something attentive. "That building's been empty a long time," she said. The librarian's words stayed with her on the walk back up the mountain road. A long time. Spoken the way people speak about something they have quietly decided not to think about anymore. She understood that instinct. There were things she had decided not to think about, too. The afternoon light was already thinning by the time she crossed the platform and unlocked the waiting room. The storm that had been building along the western ridge all day had pulled back for now, holding its shape above the tree line like something patient. She did not trust it. She went straight to the tool shed. The leather-bound ledger was where she had left it, on the second shelf above the hand-cranked lantern, its spine cracked and its cover darkened with age and a little oil from someone's hands decades before her own. She carried it and the lantern both back to the living quarters, wound the lantern's crank until the wick caught a steady glow, and sat on the edge of the cot with the ledger open across her knees. It was a maintenance record, but the man who kept it had been thorough in a way that went beyond what anyone required of him. He had cataloged everything, the heating system's quirks, the way the ticket window frame swelled in wet weather and needed planing each spring, the exact angle at which the roof above the eastern end of the platform tended to channel runoff onto the steps. He had included diagrams, drawn in pencil with a careful, deliberate hand. He had noted part numbers and the names of suppliers in Pueblo and Denver. He had written brief seasonal observations in the margins. First hard frost late this year. Mud on the north approach for 3 weeks. The record of a man who believed that paying close attention was itself a form of care. She read slowly, not skimming. Near the middle of the ledger, she found a section on the station's signal equipment. The platform lantern, the fixed one on the iron post at the north end, had been installed in 1941. The entry included its emergency signaling codes, a series of swing patterns for different conditions, each one described in plain language. Long arc, short, stop. She read it twice and sat with the image of it for a moment before she moved on. Toward the back, she found the entry she had not known she was looking for. A drainage ditch had been cut into the slope approximately a quarter-mile north of the platform in 1948, following a season of damaging runoff from the ridge above. The ditch had been sealed with a timber and stone check structure to slow the flow during heavy storms. The entry included a note in a different ink, added later. Check seal annually before spring thaw. Debris collects at the north outlet. She did not know when it had last been checked. She suspected she already knew the answer. She turned the page and kept reading, the lantern burning steady beside her. They arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the light was still thin and the air carried the smell of pine resin and last night's cold. She heard the vehicle before she saw it, a slow crunch of gravel, deliberate, official, and she stepped out onto the platform with her coffee mug still in hand. Two men, one in a pressed button shirt and dark slacks, a folder tucked under his arm. The other in work clothes and a county vest, carrying a metal clipboard. They stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her, then looked at each other, then back at her. She waited. The one with the folder introduced himself first. An alderman from the Cedar Ridge Town Council. He said the name of his office carefully, as though it were a credential she might dispute. The other was a county building inspector. They had received information, the alderman said, that the property was being occupied without authorization. He used the word occupied, with a particular weight to it, like he wanted her to feel the wrongness of the thing. She set her mug down on the windowsill and listened. The inspector moved along the platform, scribbling on his clipboard, glancing at the eave line, the foundation edge, the gap where the old freight door had warped. He noted things without explaining them. She watched him work and kept her expression still. The alderman spoke for some time. The structure had not been assessed for habitation. The rail authority retained nominal jurisdiction over the property. There were liability concerns. There were structural concerns. There was, he said, a process for these things, and she was not part of any process. He opened his folder and produced a single typed sheet, a notice of vacate. He held it out toward her. She took it, read it through completely, and folded it once along the center crease. 72 hours, the alderman said. That was reasonable. That was generous even. He did not say. Generous. Unkindly, but it landed that way. She thanked them for coming out. She said she understood the concerns. She did not say she would leave. The inspector finished his circuit of the platform and came back to stand beside the alderman, and both of them looked at her with that particular expression, not cruel, not angry, just certain. They had done this before. They expected compliance, not immediately, but eventually. Everyone left when the paper said to leave. She held the folded notice at her side and looked past them, up the track, where the mountain ridge caught the morning light in long, pale bands across the rock face. After they drove away, she went inside and set the notice on the writing desk. She smoothed it flat with one hand and left it there, visible, something she would not pretend was not real. Then she picked up the maintenance ledger, found the page about the drainage ditch, and read the note in the different ink one more time. Check seal annually before spring thaw. She put on her boots and went outside. She did not go to the drainage ditch right away. She stood on the platform for a moment, looking at the notice she could no longer see but still felt, folded flat on the desk inside. Then she went to the storage room. The clock was there, where she'd left it propped against the south wall, a large round station clock with a plain white face and black numerals, the kind that had probably hung in this waiting room for decades before someone took it down and set it aside, perhaps meaning to repair it, perhaps meaning to throw it away, and then simply never returning to do either. She carried it out to the waiting room and found the original hook still in the plaster above the ticket window, a ghost of lighter paint around it in a perfect circle. She lifted the clock onto the hook. It sat level without adjustment. It didn't run. The mechanism needed cleaning at minimum, probably a new mainspring eventually. But it hung, and it looked right, and the room looked less like a shell and more like itself. She spent the next 2 hours on the platform roof. There was a section above the east end where 3 boards had split along the grain and curled upward at the edges, letting in water whenever it rained, which stained the trim below and would eventually rot the crossbeam. She'd found replacement boards in the tool shed, seasoned and dry. She cut them to length with the handsaw, climbed up with a coffee tin of nails, and worked carefully along the ridge, fitting the new wood flush against the old. The hammer rang out clear in the cold air. She did not mind the sound. The stove flue came next. She'd noticed early on that the draw was sluggish, a partial blockage, probably years of swallow nesting in the upper section. She cleared it with a length of twisted wire, working from below, then reseated the collar joint with fireproof cement she'd found in the maintenance kit at the back of the shed. She lit a small test fire and watched the smoke curl upward straight and even. Good draw. The stove would be reliable now when she needed it. In the late afternoon, she spread her research notes across the writing desk and read through them one more time. The county property records, the photocopied newspaper article, the sketch she'd made of the station's original floor plan from the 1940s ledger. Then she pinned them in order along the wall beside the window, the way a person arranges something they intend to keep working on. The waiting room held the last of the daylight, and the clock, still and silent above the ticket window, looked as though it had always been there. She put on her coat and went out to check the ditch. The ditch ran north along the base of the embankment, a shallow channel meant to carry surface water away from the track bed. She had noticed it the first week, how it pooled near the platform's far end, how the ground stayed soft there longer than it should after a rain. She'd meant to clear it. Other tasks had come first. The storm arrived the way mountain storms do, without much negotiation. 1 hour the sky was pale and high, and the air smelled of pine resin. The next, the clouds had stacked themselves against the western peaks, and the light went the color of old pewter. She pulled her coat tighter and walked the line of the ditch with her spade over one shoulder, moving at a steady pace. The clog was 40 feet out from the platform, a dense mat of wet leaves and root fiber and silt compressed into something nearly solid. She worked it apart with the spade's edge, prying and lifting, and when the mass finally broke free, the backed-up water ran through in a dark, fast surge. She watched it go. Good enough. The ground around the track bed would drain now rather than saturate. She should have turned back. The rain was coming in earnest, cold drops that hit the back of her neck and ran under her collar. But she had her boots on, and the ditch continued north, and she'd promised herself she'd walk the full length of it before the week was out. It was the kind of thing she did, finish what she started, even when no one was watching. She walked another 100 yards, maybe more. The ditch was clear here, running freely, and the rail line ran straight beside her through the trees. She was watching the ground, checking for soft spots in the embankment, and that was why she saw it before she might have otherwise. The hillside above the track had let go. Not catastrophically, not a roar and a rush, but quietly, the way wet earth sometimes does, when nothing holds it anymore. A tongue of dark soil and broken rock had slid down across the slope and come to rest directly on the track bed. The rail on the near side had been pushed outward, the spike heads visible at wrong angles, the tie beneath it cracked and half buried. 20 feet of line, perhaps a little more. Enough. She stood very still in the rain and looked at it. She knew the freight schedule. She knew the passenger train came through in the evening. She had heard it twice from the platform, its whistle carrying up the valley before the sound dissolved in the pines. She did not know exactly what time it was. She looked at the sky. The light was already going. She did not let herself think about it too long. Thinking too long was how cold got into decisions. She turned and ran. The path back along the ditch was uneven, and the rain had made the ground slick, and she ran anyway, not recklessly, but with everything she had, her boots finding purchase where they could, her arms out for balance when the slope tipped. The station lights were visible before she reached the platform, the two windows of the waiting room throwing their pale yellow rectangles into the wet dark, and she had never been so glad to see them. She went straight to the platform. Not inside, to the platform, to the post at the near end where the signal lantern hung on its iron bracket, the same lantern she had cleaned and rehung 3 weeks ago when she found it in the storage room, its glass filmed with 20 years of grime, its reservoir empty. She had filled the reservoir from the lamp oil she found in the tool shed. She had trimmed the wick. She had done it because the maintenance ledger said a station lantern should always be ready, and because doing things properly had seemed important, even when no one was watching. She unhooked it now with shaking hands. The matches were in her jacket pocket. She had started carrying them the day she found the shed. Another small habit, another thing the ledger had made feel necessary. She struck the first one, and it died in the wind. She turned her body to block the rain and struck the second, and the wick caught, a small orange flame that steadied as she lowered the glass. She held it and looked north along the track. Nothing yet. Trees. Rain. The sound of water moving fast in the ditch she had just run back from. She opened the ledger in her mind the way she had learned to do. She had read it carefully enough that certain pages were simply there when she needed them. 3 slow swings horizontal. Caution. Short, long, short in a vertical arc. Stop, stop, stop. The emergency pattern. She had read it twice, to be sure she understood. She stood at the edge of the platform and began. The lantern traced its arc through the rain, slow and deliberate, and then the short and the long and the short again, and she kept going, her arm steady, her eyes fixed north on the curve where the track bent around the mountain's shoulder and disappeared into the dark. And then there was light around that curve, not hers, a white beam, wide and certain, sweeping the wet rail ahead of it as the evening passenger train came around the bend. She did not stop swinging. She swung harder. The brakes caught. The sound came a moment later, steel finding steel across the distance, and the headlights slowed. The train stopped. She could hear it even through the rain, the long exhale of brakes releasing pressure, the creak of couplings settling, the engine idling down to a low and patient rumble. The headlight held steady on the wet rail, maybe 200 yards out, and then figures were moving in that white light, dropping down from the cab with lanterns of their own, and she stood on the platform with her arm still raised and the signal lantern still burning, and let herself breathe. They found the track damaged themselves, 20 minutes later. She heard the radio crackling from the cab when one of the crew members walked her back to the station out of the rain, his jacket offered over her shoulders without a word. She did not tell him how long she had been standing there. She did not tell him much of anything. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. In the days that followed, the quiet was different. Word traveled the way it always does in small mountain towns, not fast, but thorough. The crew's report went to the regional rail authority. The rail authority called the town. The town called a meeting she was not invited to but heard about afterward from the woman at the hardware store who had always been decent to her. The alderman came on a Wednesday morning when the light was still low and golden through the waiting room windows. He stood on the platform with his hat in his hands, an old gesture, she thought, one she had not expected from him, and he said that the town owed her an apology and that the town intended to make it right. His voice was careful. He was not a man who found apology easy. She did not make it harder for him than it needed to be. The offer came 2 days later, in writing, on letterhead from both the rail authority and the county. Caretaker and restoration manager. A modest salary. legal occupancy of the station master's quarters. The station designated a historic waypoint, to be restored gradually and with her as the guiding hand. She read it twice. She signed it. That evening she hung her duffel bag on the iron hook beside the door, the hook she had cleaned rust from weeks ago without knowing why, only that it seemed like a thing worth doing. The stove was already warm. She had split wood that morning out of habit, the same way she did everything now, because the place deserved it, because the work was real, because this was hers. She set the kettle on and measured coffee into the pot and listened to the rain moving off east over the mountain, leaving the sky clean and full of stars. She did not need to go anywhere.